Um, I might say that I also asked a couple of friends about Mike and was told quite similarly that he's a very fair-minded person, so I guess we both passed each other's background checks. I do feel at a little bit of a disadvantage because I have this sense that our roles have almost been reversed, that he's responding to me rather than the other way around. So, and what I had prepared has to do with the reading material that I take it you all got from the book. And there will be, I trust, plenty of time later in the afternoon to discuss things backwards and back and forth. So this thing has two parts. First, some stuff on the methods for evaluating miracle stories. That was Mike's first presentation. And secondly, we'll have a little bit of Sunday school with some Bible stories you may not have heard before. Now, I do have to issue a disclaimer, and it's an important disclaimer. I am not a Bible scholar, Mike is. So, caveat emptor. Most of what I say in part 2 could be wrong. In fact, most of you are going to hope that it is wrong. But it might be right, or at least I hope to convince you of that. And if you were to agree with that, I think you might need to realign your posterior odds that Jesus rose from the dead. Of course, nothing I say in part 1 will be wrong. So here's the menu. I aim to defend Hume's basic position, but Hume's argument must be reformulated in some somewhat significant ways, I think. First, Hume is nowhere near as clear as he needs to be on what a miracle is, and he is not alone on that score. Secondly, he lacked proper knowledge of confirmation theory. Unfortunately, Bayes' work, Bayes was a contemporary, was only posthumously published by a friend of Bayes only 2 years before Hume died. And so far as I know, Hume never at least published any further reflections in the light of Hume's work, of Bayes' work. Thirdly, and quite importantly, Hume does not have a sophisticated account of defeasible laws of nature and how they are confirmed or disconfirmed. I think in part because he has a stunted conception of causation and of laws of nature generally. He tends to think in terms of positive and negative instances and their relative frequencies, and not enough about inference to the best explanation. Still, Hume's basic intuitions, I think, are on the mark. He has a better explanation of religious miracle stories than the apologetic ones. But does he have the best sort of explanation of our data? I think the answer to that question is no. And one reason I think that is because I think that Hume violates a principle of charity that I want to defend. And let's see if I can do this now. Here's Eben's principle of charity. So you got two interpretations of a text, and one interpretation imputes a significant amount of stupidity to the author of the text, and the other doesn't. Then there's a presumption, it's a defeasible presumption, but there's a presumption in favor of the interpretation that does not impute gross stupidity. Now, the presumption can be defeated by independent evidence of stupidity. On the other side, we shouldn't presume authorial genius absent special evidence of authorial genius. In the case of the Gospels and Paul, we have tons of special evidence of authorial genius. These are, just as literary works, really quite extraordinary, and as displaying a mastership of a mastery of the Jewish traditions. They are also extraordinary and extremely subtle. And so I have to draw the conclusion just on internal evidence that these guys were really, really smart. So I'm going to lean way over on the side of the view that whatever these texts say, the odds are in favor of they're saying things that are true, or mostly true. And if not true, then rational for smart people to have believed at the time. So that's a strong constraint for me. There's another constraint that is an important one, I think, and it has to do with the fact that a lot of people, including a lot of smart people, devoted their lives, became Christian converts, obviously, when the movement started, devoted their lives to the faith, often at some considerable risk. Whatever those truths are, they must have had a strong grip on people. They must have been seen as quite profound and important, given the cultural context, and in fact, given the kind of existential crises which people in the Roman Empire generally were experiencing during the first century. So if one comes up with an account that doesn't explain how that can be, that's obviously a demerit of the account. Now, so what would the alternative be to apologetics on the one side and Hume on the other? And I don't know of any answer to that question other than that the texts are not, in many things they say, to be taken literally. But it's one thing to wave your hand in the direction of figurative accounts. And it's another thing to try to figure out what they actually mean. Right? So I think the important project here is to do more than hand waving, but to try to figure out keys that can unlock the meanings if they are indeed figurative and not literal. How do you do that? What tools can you use? What I've found helpful is appeal to philosophy of, not philosophy, anthropology of religion. And that involves, for most of us, a paradigm shift. I hate the term, but that really does describe what has to go on. I mean, you have to start thinking about the possibility of seeing these texts in a way you're really not used to at all. Let me mention just 4 figures that have been influential for me in the history of anthropology. I have plenty of bones to pick with them. But I should mention, first of all, Emil Durkheim, who recognized, as scholars now generally do, that in tribal societies, and also in the ancient Near East generally, people did not make a conceptual distinction between political matters and religious matters. These were just not two sorts of business. And there are various ways you can try to slice and dice that, but I think it's fair to say, for example, that in ancient Greece, religious piety was the same as civic piety. That's what being a good citizen amounted to. Now, what Durkheim does with that is to suggest that the gods are unconscious projections of dimly perceived social realities. I would take issue with the claim that it's unconscious. It seems to me they just were talking about social realities in often very sophisticated ways. How does that sort out? Well, that's a long story. It's a whole chapter in this book project that I've just finished. But let me just give you a little bit of a hint. So nations, we ourselves refer to as if they were corporate persons of some kind. They act, they deliberate, etc. They have personal characteristics. They're not exactly material things, though. And they are, in some sense, at least for the citizens of a nation, ubiquitous. They're kind of everywhere, sort of omnipresent. They are at least potentially immortal, and they tend to be thought of as never suffering a demise. They are the source of the law and of social authority. They have, in fact, precisely many of the characteristics that the gods tend to have. And I want to say that, in fact, what people were talking about is just that sort of thing. And they understood it at a quite abstract and theoretical level. Now, there are big ontological questions here. Are institutional entities like nations, are they real things? I am a realist about them, but that's obviously a controversial matter. How are they related exactly to their realizations or embodiments? That's an important metaphysical question you really have to think about. And we have not just gods, but in the context we're talking about, you've got angels, you've got demons, you've got souls, you've got a whole sort of population of different kinds of entities that you have to really see if you can understand in a way that will map onto the texts that we have. That's a big project, and I can't even begin to undertake it here. Second figure I'll mention is Marcel Mauss, a classic book called Le Don, The Gift, about principles of reciprocity and exchange, which are in fact cultural universals. Very interesting and important. Arnold von Gennep, Les Rites de Passage, rites of passage. Gennep looks at cultures all over the world at rites of passage, many of which involve, and not accidentally so, symbolic death and resurrection. The old person dies to the old social role and is reborn into a new social role. Okay, and often the rituals themselves enact a death and resurrection. And last but certainly not least, Claude Lévi-Strauss, Structural Analysis of Myth. All these guys are French Jews. And I'm thinking, what's up with that? I don't know. By the way, I don't understand the notion of myth in the way most people do, nor in the way that it is sometimes used in the Greek. So you had that quotation from Thessalonians, I think it was. I got my principle of charity. I think by and large myths tell us things that are true. They're meant to tell us things that are true, and they succeed. And if not true, then rationally believed. 50 years ago, 45 years ago, when I first formulated these ideas, saying the stuff I'm saying to you now would have been being a voice crying in the wilderness. Not so true anymore. A lot of people have begun to take anthropology of religion seriously. I might just mention off the top of my head Marcus Borg, Sanders, Horsley, N.T. Wright, a whole bunch of other people. All right. I should have given you this thing for decoding criteria for decoding the figurative. So I'll just let you read that. There are certain signposts. They're not infallible. It is an art, not a science to do this. But to give you some kind of clue as to what sorts of things one looks for if one is an anthropologist trying to figure out what's going on in these strange stories that people tell. This one I did mention here. Okay, so this is again a rough and ready first stab at what a miracle is. There are lots of epicycles, causal overdetermination, preempting, all kinds of stuff you have to worry about. But I think this is a good way to get started. It's the defeat of a defeasible law or laws of nature by the more or less direct action of a supernatural agent, and in particular, God. Okay? So it's God doing stuff. And the picture is not that the laws are violated, they're defeasible laws. They can be defeated in the following sense. You've got an event which is such that were only natural or physical forces acting on it, it would behave in such and such a way, right? But in fact, it doesn't behave in exactly that way, not because those natural forces aren't acting on it, but because there's some additional force acting on it whose source is not natural, right? So God gives stuff an extra shove in directions that he wants. That seems to me is the most coherent way to think about what a miracle might be. So there's been a lot of stuff written often by atheists to the effect that miracles are just outside the purview of scientific, or for that matter, historical investigation. Most of that strikes me as nonsense. The basic business of science is to discover causes. Miracles are caused by God, maybe Satan. I don't see why, in principle, you couldn't have an inference to the best explanation whose conclusion is probably God did this. Because it sure doesn't look like something that can be fully explained just in terms of the available natural forces. Well, let me just say a brief word about the question, are miracles metaphysically impossible? My view is maybe. I actually lean in that direction, okay? And again, that's a bigger story than I can tell here. I've found that the clearest way to tell the story, though, is to worry about, in fact, Newton's third law, which says that, when you push on something, it pushes back. Push on something is to exert a force. I think, not uncontroversially, but I think that forces just are causings. That's what they are. And it's essentially or necessarily so, okay? So if it's not a force, that's not a causing. And if God can't push on things, then he can't do stuff, okay? As far as I know, I could be corrected here, but as far as I know, the third law is indefeasible. Now, there are ways to get around this. There's some very interesting work by John Robert Russell on collapse of quantum wave functions and how God could affect that, which would not violate Newton's third law. And I'm not enough of a physicist to make a judgment about that. So I'm going to say maybe on this point. And in fact, just to prove how generous I am, oh, wait a minute. Yeah, okay. We're not quite there yet. Are miracles, by definition, unique, unrepeatable, improbable, beyond the reach of science, destructive of knowledge of the past? No. If God can do them, he can do them as many times as he pleases. He might not do it often, but that's just contingent fact, I take it. They need not be unique or unrepeatable. They need not be improbable. I just tried to suggest that they're not beyond the reach of science. Nor do we have to worry, I think, about certain atheist worries that if we couldn't rely on the laws of nature being exceptionless, we could never make inferences about the past. Okay, so that said, I want to give Mike a freebie. Okay, for the purposes of this argument. Now I see that I'm running off the edge of my screen here. All right. So what is Hume trying to prove? And what is he not trying to prove? He's not trying to prove that miracles are impossible. Right? I mean, Hume wouldn't have any truck with that sort of thing in any case. And he's not trying to prove that miracles have never occurred. It's just not his project. Or that sense experience could never establish a miracle, right? He's interested in testimony, what testimony can establish for us. And he doesn't think either that testimony could never provide strong evidence for a miracle. In fact, he allows for the at least theoretical possibility that evidence could give us, that testimony could give us evidence for the occurrence of a miracle that could match in strength the evidence against that. All right? Whether it could overpower it. Actually, there's been mathematical work within the Bayesian framework to show that you get enough independent evidence that could overpower any level of probability that's less than 1. Okay. So what is he trying to show? Well, that miracle testimony, especially in support of a religious cause, never has or could establish rational belief in a miracle. So let me, perhaps all too briefly, try to defend Hume against Mike. So I guess I'm, in the interest of time, not going to say too much about some of these. In the chapter that you read, Mike complains that Hume's criteria for trustworthiness of miracle testimony are too strict. He sets the bar too high. I don't see why one shouldn't set the bar high, given the cloud under which miracle testimony labors, because number one, it's pretty extraordinary, and number two, there is the temptation, which we know on empirical grounds all too often gets succumbed to spin the truth, to put it politely. You better have high standards. Mike mentioned Craig Keener. This is a huge 2-volume thing, over 1,200 pages. We can talk about it if you want. I'm not impressed, I'll say that. Secondly, Hume appeals to uniform experience and the uniformity of nature. And Mike takes this to be similar to a principle of analogy that has been invoked by various theologians who have been skeptical about miracles. And the complaint is that this would exclude scientific anomalies and, interestingly enough, dinosaurs. I don't think Hume would ever, given the evidence we have for dinosaurs now, have hesitated at all to allow that there were dinosaurs. This, I think, misunderstands what Hume is up to. With respect to anomalies, I think there are at least 4 interesting cases that we can distinguish, and it's really worth thinking about what the confirmation conditions are that they impose on laws of nature. So, first of all, you might have a regularity which has occasional exceptions, and it turns out that the exceptions are evidence that the law is a statistical law, like the laws of quantum mechanics. So that's one kind of case. We want to distinguish that case from a case where something weird happens, which we have reason to believe that we can explain away without modifying what the laws of nature are that we're committed to. I think pulsars are an excellent example of that. We can talk about that in Q&A if you want to. There are game-changing anomalies that really do threaten what we took to be the laws of nature. If in a lab people were making some highly purified water and the stuff started spontaneously bursting into flames, I suspect that would be a game changer. That is to say, we know enough about water, I think, to know that current science couldn't explain that without having to give way in some way or other. And finally, miracles. Now, Hume is alive to these distinctions, though what he says about them is not very sophisticated. Right? So remember, he has the case of the Indian who doesn't believe that water can turn solid, right? And who is within his intellectual rights not to believe that, though he ought to be worried about the question whether the conditions in Moscow are different from the conditions in India. And you also have Hume talking about, suppose that the Earth was dark for several days, and we have sort of global reports of that. And he also has, as an example of statistical behavior, the weather. So I think that, in fact, and this is as much as I'll say about this, I think that you can give a reasonably good Humean account of how to distinguish these things, though in the end, I would prefer to think about it in ways that are not Humean. Third, Mike objects to Hume's use of antecedent probabilities in part 2 of Miracles. If I understand Mike's objection here, I think he's just objecting to Hume's invocation of the straight rule of induction, where you look at a fair sample, and you look at relative frequencies, and you just project a probability like that. That seems to me to be a controversial rule. It's inconsistent with Bayesian updating, but it's not a crazy way to try to proceed. And after all, Hume's use of it in this context is just to give us some sort of estimate of how likely it is that people might be tempted to tell miracle stories. And his appeal here is to what he takes to be a certain psychological feature of human beings are fascinated by, really wild kind of stuff. I'm not a psychologist. I think there's some truth to that psychological observation, probably. Still, I think we do need to rethink the way Hume puts his case. How should we think about all this? Let me give you an illustration that I think might perhaps be helpful. When I was a freshman physics major in college, we had to do something called the Millikan oil drop experiment. It's a classic experiment. that was devised around 100 years ago to measure the charge in an electron. We had these crappy little old gadgets to do this with. And it's a delicate observation to make. And like my colleagues in the class, I came up with a value for the charge of an electron that was, I don't know, 15% away from what we think of as the value of an electron. And one thing that I did not succeed in doing was revolutionizing physics. Why not? Because nobody, including I myself, believed my value, right? Why didn't we? Well, because there's an obvious explanation or a set of circumstances that would explain why I got a value that was a bit off. And if one were to accept the conclusion that there are, occasional electrons that are that far off or in fact at all off from a certain value, that would in fact revolutionize physics. That would be a major, major reform that physics would have to undergo. So a lot of stuff that we have tons and tons of evidence for would all go out the window. Okay. So one point I want to make about this is that actually making these sorts of judgments is radically holistic. It's not a question of sort of local data that you have, but all kinds of data that can be relevant to whether you think somebody's observed something correctly or not. Now, theists also have a large theory in play. They have views about God's purposes and projects, about human freedom, sin, stubbornness, lots of things. And all of those can be invoked in forming an estimate of the likelihood that God can and would perform a particular sort of miracle under given conditions. The atheist, meanwhile, invokes her knowledge of human nature, etc., and each offers an explanation of the data. Now, a note here, and I'll come back to this. I take the data to be, that you're trying to explain, to be largely the texts, not supposed hard historical facts. What we have are the texts. That's what we have to start with. So there's a contest of explanations. The atheist relies upon views about human motivation and behavior that justify placing considerable prima facie confidence in a deception scenario and a hefty prior probability to the claims about human nature. For all this, there is independent empirical evidence that human nature displays these sorts of characteristics. The theist can perhaps also get a decent likelihood for a miracle by building into her God hypothesis, T, enough about divine power and intentions, but at the cost of seriously lowering the prior probability. The more you build into the hypothesis, the further the prior goes down. Unless there's independent confirming evidence for T. That's the advantage that the naturalist has here. They get all kinds of independent confirming evidence for what they want to claim about human nature. And so here I think the theist is not a match for the skeptic. The fourth objection is the many contenders objection, and Mike here does what seems to be the right thing to do, which is to claim that there's good enough evidence with respect to the Christian miracle stories and not good enough evidence with respect to the competitors. I have time. I'm going to look at how the evidence shakes out with respect to the New Testament a bit. As for the rivals, they are a multitude, and it's not a trivial task to evaluate just how good or bad the evidence is. I had an African student years ago, very intelligent young woman. Her father was a Christian minister. They were from Ghana, originally Cote d'Ivoire. Her mother was a high priestess in the local African cult where they came from. And she told me she knew of Africans who had changed into animals. I didn't believe her. I bet you wouldn't believe her either. So interesting case is Carlos Castaneda. This is probably before the time of most of you. You remember Tales of Power, Journey to Ixtlan. Very, very powerful, actually. Odd writing style. This was an anthropologist who was studying the Yaqui culture in northern Mexico, hooked up supposedly with a brujo, a shaman, Yaqui shaman named Don Juan. All sorts of amazing stuff, really amazing stuff. None of it was true.
Sold a lot of books.
But it sold a lot of books and it sold a lot of people. And in fact, I think it was an experiment to see if you could sell people. I think it was an anthropological experiment. Okay? Think about it that way, the light bulbs start to go on. Anyway, Joseph Smith, not just the golden plates. I mean, I'm not very familiar with this stuff. There are a lot of miracle stories within Mormonism. Spiritualism, which managed to convince Arthur Conan Doyle, of all people. Madame Blavatsky, Theosophy. I don't know if you guys know anything about that stuff. For a while back there in the 60s and 70s, the Maharishi and his TM stuff with people levitating in the golden domes. I mean, this stuff is all over the place. But in the end, I want to undefend Hume. Because I think his interpretation it's what I call the fraud and folly view, right? There were a bunch of people who were in the business of hoodwinking other people, and there were a bunch of people that got snookered, and somehow or other, this particular case managed to survive, right? I don't believe that. Or at least I want hard to look for an interpretation that doesn't require me to believe something like that, even though if the chips are down and I have to choose between that and supposing that the stories are literally true, I'm going to believe Hume. So I'm going to try to say some things about this view here. I won't say what I mean by charter there, but you can ask me. Mike's book is a meticulous and compendious job of documenting reasons for taking the resurrection to have been a historical event. Pretty good. His procedure is fundamentally and correctly one of searching for the best explanation for the data. 3 preliminary comments. 1, the relevant background knowledge consists of well-confirmed facts about ancient Near Eastern culture and history, well-confirmed laws of nature, and well-confirmed facts about human nature. 2nd, I said this before, the data, primarily certain New Testament texts. He hopes to abbreviate the task by appealing to a fairly long list of historical claims as historical bedrock on the strength of scholarly consensus. And I would get into a long conversation about how this scholarly consensus was arrived at, what sorts of criteria people use. I am not at all persuaded of the efficacy of a lot of these criteria. But what I just want to declare here is that for him, those are the data to be explained, not for me. For me, the texts are the hard data that we have. So I want to begin with the text. Note that the third thing is critical for an inference to the best explanation to consider all the possible explanations, or at least all the plausible explanations. And I think the biggest liability for Mike's reasoning lies here. So, as I said, I don't find the fraud and folly line to be very plausible. I don't, for example, find it very plausible to think, what some atheists have claimed, that mass hallucination explains the Pentecost event. I just don't find that particularly attractive. But I want to focus on figurative readings. Let's begin by looking at a speed bump in Mike's argument for historicity, Matthew 27:52 to 53. This is so Jesus has died, there's been an earthquake, and it says the tombs also were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. After his resurrection, they came out of the tombs, entered the holy city, and appeared to many. So they're raised. When he dies, they kind of hang around in their tombs for 3 days, maybe out of politeness, because in 1 Corinthians 15:23, Paul says that Jesus is the first fruits, right? So they don't want to barge into the queue here. And I want to say, what the hell? And Mike says pretty much the same thing. He has better sense than to take this passage literally. In fact, he quotes, mind you, this occurs only in Matthew, nowhere else that I know of at all, not in Josephus. He quotes Jewish and Roman parallels that are clearly figurative. Such prodigies symbolically mark the death of kings, and so too with Jesus. But something more is here than a royal death. Let me mention, by the way, that precisely at this point, you're appealing to Hellenistic sources, just when it's useful. There is a ton of scholarship, starting with George Caird and going forward, that I think shows pretty conclusively that Hellenism had very significant influence on Jewish religious thinking in the first century. Now, I recently discovered that Mike got into a lot of hot water among some evangelicals because of his sensible figurative reading of this passage. And so I feel some reluctance in playing the role of the devil's advocate, or one might say Geisler's advocate here. I feel really bad about this. But look, clearly there's a worry that Geisler, I think, must have, I didn't find out the details. But here's the worry. So Mike says, okay, right there, when we're talking about Jesus' death and resurrection, we have a story that's apocryphal. It's the same kind of thing. It's people rising from the dead, right? How do you draw the line between the one and the other? That's the worry, surely, right? Now, if that's symbolic and not historical, what about the resurrection of Jesus? And here's what Mike says. The larger context is that handout that I gave you. Okay, this is part of the book that you guys didn't read, or at least you weren't assigned it. So Mike says this. He thinks that there's no indication that the early Christians interpreted Jesus' resurrection as a metaphorical or poetic, in a metaphorical or poetic sense. And moreover, he actually said this here. Why didn't Christian opponents criticize the early Christians for misunderstanding their own stories, and why didn't they, defend that in certain ways? The same could be said, though, the same worries could be raised about the claim that the saints rose out of the earth. An exactly parallel kind of case. And I think there's a good answer to those questions. Now, so I want to, in the short time that I have left, give you some reasons to wonder about whether the Passion narratives should be taken literally or not. Okay? Just to wonder about that. You know the story of Barabbas? Some of the ancient manuscripts of the Gospel of Matthew tell us that his name was Jesus Barabbas. Well, Yeshua happens to be one of the most common male names in first century Judea. No big news there. But it's Jesus Bar Abba, Jesus the Son of the Father. I think we've landed in the land of Oz. And that's not a bad analogy, perhaps, because at least there was some debate that the Oz books by L. Frank Baum were actually political, what's the word I want? Allegories, right. Now, so I read that, and I think, what is going on here? Right? So you've got a Jesus, the Son of the Father, and another Jesus, the Son of the Father, and something's being done here. Thought for a while, and then it occurred to me, Leviticus 16, which describes the Yom Kippur ritual, the ritual of atonement. There are 2 goats. You know this stuff? 2 goats. There's a goat that gets slaughtered on the altar to atone for the sins, and then the high priest puts his hands on the other goat, which has a red ribbon tied around his horns, and he lays the sins of the people on the goat. It gets driven out into the desert, over a cliff, and into the arms of Azazel, who is a demonic inhabitant of the wilderness, and who is sometimes in Jewish lore identified with Satan. Now, it turns out, I mean, I had to start digging around. There's a terrific book by Daniel Sturkle Ben Ezra called The Impact of Yom Kippur on Early Christianity that really sets this out. Turns out the early church fathers were exactly onto this understanding. And interestingly, they had debates about whether Jesus was the scapegoat or the slaughter goat. Okay. Longer story there than I can tell, but I'm certain that Jesus was the slaughter goat, that Barabbas was the scapegoat. And interestingly enough, what that does structurally is it places Pilate in the role of the high priest. And it places the mob in the role of the wilderness and the demonic Azazel. And all sorts of meaning starts to open up for you that you might not see if you hadn't gotten onto this clearly, I think, symbolic feature of what looks like a straightforward historical narrative. That's one case. Judas is another case. I didn't even begin to have time to talk about Judas and a whole bunch of stuff that I'll bet you haven't seen when you read the Passion narratives. Let me talk very quickly, if I may, about Matthew 12:39 to 42. Pharisees and scribes ask Jesus for a sign, and he says to them, "Verily I say unto you, an evil and adulterous generation asks for a sign, but no sign shall be given it except the sign of Jonah. For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the whale, so shall the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth." The men of Nineveh will rise up with this generation and condemn it, for they repented at the preaching of Jonah, and something greater than Jonah is here. The queen of the south will rise up with this generation and condemn it, for she came from the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and something greater than Solomon is here. Now there's a ton of information there, a whole ton. I can only, at this point, ask 3 days and 3 nights. Mike worries about this. Well, maybe don't worry about it much. I think you should at least discuss it. It's not 3 days and 3 nights. Matthew has Jesus dying pretty precisely at 3 p.m. on Friday. He's presumably buried before sundown on Friday. And he's out of the grave at or before dawn on Sunday. A day and a half. And I've got a principle of charity. I want to see if I can read these texts in such a way that Jesus hasn't really fumbled the ball with respect to what I think is the second most important prophecy that he makes. Is there any way you can get 3 days and 3 nights out of this? And the answer is yes, there is. Maybe not in 2 minutes, but you believe me, you can do it. So there are 3 things that you have to talk about here, and I'm just going to, I guess, gesture at them. First is that Jonah descends into the belly of the whale, the Leviathan, I think, into the chaos waters. There's an enormous amount of literature in the Hebrew Bible about the chaos waters, the pit, Sheol, descending into Sheol and having, praying to God to rescue you, and God pulls you up out of these chaos waters, right? This is a kind of symbolism that is as pervasive as any single, what I would call mytheme, in the Hebrew Bible.
Evan, we started late, so you can go past the hour.
Can I go to 5?
Yeah, 5 after. Sure, easily.
I mean 5 p.m.
Certainly 5 past the hour.
Well, I really could. But, okay, so there's all this symbolism. It's all over the Psalms. It's in the book of Jonah. There are a number of Psalms, though, that I think illuminate what the metaphor is. And they include 2 Samuel 22 and Psalm 69, Psalms 88 to 89, which is really just one psalm, I think, and Psalm 22, which is an important psalm for Christians. The chaos waters, the deep, the Tehom, identified with the pit, identified with Sheol, the realm of death, gets identified with the king's enemies. To be in the pit is to be under mortal threat from the enemies, and finally is identified with social chaos. It's actually rather explicit in these psalms. So, death and resurrection is a way of talking about a threat to social welfare that is a potentially mortal threat. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Second thing is Jewish dualism. Again, there's a ton ancient Jewish literature that postulates a kind of a mapping, almost an isomorphism or mirroring between the social structures of the world, the empirical world as we know it, and stuff in heaven. So God with his counselors in heaven, or his heavenly council, if you will, just as you have the king with his council. There's way more stuff than I can talk about. There is some evidence, though it's somewhat controversial, that in at least the First Temple period, the king would engage in a periodic ritual in which he would enter the Holy of Holies, sit on the throne of God, and reenact the creation story. And when you start to trace out this sort of symbolism, you begin to think, well, so there's the stuff that goes on in the real world, which is pretty messed up sometimes, but there's a kind of an ideal model for how it should be up in heaven. In fact, there's a model of the temple up in heaven, which is shown to Moses as a vision for how it should be. And just as there is a kind of a metaphysical, if you will, correlate of earthly realities that represent the ideal, there's a metaphysical correlate of the powers of social destruction and dissolution. These are called powers of the air by Paul. Jesus talks about the hour of darkness. The demonic is, again, kind of a parallel. When I started thinking about this, I thought, well, we've got a day and a half where he's in the bowels of the earth. Could there be a day and a half when he's fighting the demonic powers in their earthly realization, which would be the mirror image of what is going on in the belly of in the bowels of the earth? Okay? So it'd be a day and a half and a day and a half, right? Now, interestingly, when Jesus dies, the disciples have all scattered. The only people left are his women followers, okay? And they're the people that discover the empty tomb as well. And there's a lot of ancient Near East imagery of women as birth givers who are there as sort of caretakers when somebody is born and when they die. The Virgil's Aeneid gives us a wonderful example of Aeneas going down into the underworld, and he is shepherded down there by this priestess who is addressed by Virgil as mother, goddess, priestess, and prophet. So you have women bracketing the descent into Sheol and the rising. If I'm right about my hypothesis that there's a structural parallel that should be the day and a half in front, any anthropologist thinks about this and say, well, there should be a woman there. There is. And she's the woman who anoints him at the supper at Bethany, which is clearly a messianic anointing. He's being anointed king, right? But how does Jesus describe what she's doing to him? Do you happen to know? The word is entaphiasia. It means embalmment. He's being embalmed. And the very next verse says, and then Judas takes off to betray him. That's the kind of structure I see as mythical structure. Last thing. It escapes me why people don't. Oh, everybody sees that when Jesus is mocked and scourged and the crown of thorns is placed on his head, he's mocked as the king of the Jews, right? And we understand the irony. He really is the king of the Jews. The people that are doing it are completely oblivious to that. What we don't tend to recognize though I think it's actually pretty obvious, is that there's a double irony. He is king of the Jews. He's also being crowned emperor of Rome. Why do you think that? It's in the Roman precinct, the Praetorium, by the Roman soldiers who were the kingmakers of the day. They placed the purple robe on him, which was legally not to be worn by anybody but the emperor at the time. And the centurion says, when he dies on the cross, surely this was the Son of God, which was a title for Roman emperors. So I think Durkheim when I think about this stuff. Even if I set aside Hume on miracles entirely, just forget Hume's argument completely, and ask, what are the odds that Jesus was crucified, and in particular that the general outlines of the Passion narrative are true? I'd say quite low. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Might there be a few questions? Actually, I think we're both supposed to get up here at this point. Is that right?
We'll take a little break. We'll take a little break.
Oh, we're
Take a
going
little
to,
break,
okay.
And then we'll have
Yeah, yeah. So you can't ask the questions yet because I told you I was going to take up
Yeah,
the whole
well,
hour.
totally
And
fair. We'll have
I just kind of barely made it.
So we'll start at 3:20 again. 2:20, thank you.
Do you guys have two mics, one for me
Yeah,
and
we
one
do.
for Mike?
Do we?